excited today to be able to introduce Professor of German and Affiliated Professor of Language Science at the University of California, Irvine, as a Professor Levine, but he's coming to us today from Vermont. So Glenn is actually my former professor at UC Irvine, mentor, dissertation advisor, and now my colleague and friend. So he's written tons and tons of stuff. It would take forever to list all of the different books and articles that he's published. So I picked a few that might be interesting for us today, of A Human Ecological Language Pedagogy in 2020, Fostering Compassion Through Translanguaging Pedagogy in the German Willkommensklasse with Bridget Swanson in 2019, The Effects of Instructor Language Choice on Second Language Vocabulary Learning and Listening Comprehension in 2018. He's also the language program director at UCI, working with and helping train graduate students to be effective language teachers using new media and different creative pedagogies. And in addition to all of that, he's also the co-author, together with Bridget Swanson and Christina Fry, of the introductory through intermediate German curriculum text, Augenblicke, German through Film, Media, and Texts, which is forthcoming this year. So he's coming to us today at WNL to discuss decolonizing the curriculum, promoting social justice through language learning.
Cool. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, I'm really pleased and excited to be invited. When Jamie suggested, I thought, oh, that's really cool. And I don't get often to, interact, especially this year, with just people working in language classrooms. As I think everybody here, it sounds like from the conversation I heard, everybody here is teaching language classes or something related to it. So hopefully what I'm bringing you today will be giving you stuff to think about and maybe ways to orient your teaching. And if anything, maybe you'll find out that you're already doing maybe a lot of this, and we can talk about that after, kind of the way you already are teaching kind of resonates with some of the ideas that I want to present. I've tried to keep it kind of thin on like quotes and things that take a lot of time to go through. And I want to focus mostly on like the core ideas of what I've framed out over several years of as an ecological approach to language teaching and learning. And more recently, kind of, especially in the most recent book project Jamie mentioned, kind of thinking a lot about the ways that an ecological approach aligns with social justice pedagogies that have developed over the last few decades. And most recently, even really interesting discussions about decolonization of the language curriculum that I just find really promising, and kind of helps a lot of the work that's been done in ecological linguistics, as it's called, kind of come into tune in a way with what I think language education can be doing. So what I'm going to do, and hopefully this works for you guys, I want to talk for, I put 35 minutes. I'm starting a timer so that I keep on track. Hold on. Sorry. I'm starting a timer so that I can kind of, actually for like 32 minutes, because I want to keep it short so that we have time to talk for a bit. So I want to have just a brief discussion of like why this kind of an approach that I'm trying to talk about is important in terms of what I'm calling the stakes for language learning in our time. And then I'll spend most of the time on kind of how you would implement the kind of approach I'm talking about. And I've broken it into 3 pieces for this talk, what I'm calling critical engagement with otherness, or sort of decolonizing the curriculum as one focus, creative thinking as a second, and transformation of conflict and social justice. Sort of, I've lumped all this together in one point because if in order to break them all apart, it just takes too long. And I want to just treat it briefly enough, hopefully to prompt some questions and discussion. I'll end with talking about what I see as some interesting opportunities as well as some obstacles of the current sort of political, social, educational climate that we're working in. And I would say it makes sense because of the Zoom space here. As I'm going along, if you want to, you can already post in responses or comments or questions into the chat window. I won't respond to them now while I'm going through my presentation, but they'll be there and we can hopefully get to as many of them as you want. And that doesn't mean you can't also, just ask questions afterwards too. We're not doing that thing where I'm only taking questions that are in the chat space, as I've been to a few of those. So let's talk about the why, like why would this be important? First, from sort of the pedagogical or teaching side of it, I should also mention, Jamie's been to a number of talks I've given. I've taken out all of the kind of parenthetical citations because they were kind of just cluttering up the slides. The last couple of slides of this PowerPoint that you can have after is all the references, all the works that I'm working from. So a lot of scholars have talked about their dissatisfaction, or at the very least unease, with a number of things. One of them is what we might call the traditional goals of language education, and I won't unpack what that means. I'll leave everybody to kind of decide what we mean by that. But if you read a lot of applied linguists in the last 10 to 20 years, really, you'll see an increasing dissatisfaction with kind of the rather limited and limiting frame that we often teach language to adults. Several have also criticized or complained about sort of how language education in the United States has kind of adopted or co-opted the sort of neoliberal discourses of educational institutions in order a lot of times to kind of protect themselves and remain relevant. But be that as it may, that sort of market orientation is a lot of how you might describe how we promote and teach our classes. And a lot of scholars such as Heidi Burns or Claire Crumsh have written a lot about the way that language education kind of is based on limited or limiting assumptions about what language is and what learning is, in fairly structuralist terms, and that in fact that's not really how language happens and how learning happens, and yet our curricula are kind of based on those ideas. Also, the observation of extreme variability of individual outcomes and our persistent inability to really address that, except on the ground in the form of like really good teaching, right? But in terms of sort of larger curricular thinking, it's very difficult to address. Related to that is sort of a perennial disconnect between the idea of language skills and the ways that we tend to pursue humanistic inquiry and learning, especially in the humanities departments that language departments are in. And then the next one would be what my friend Ivine Malachi once talked about, is happy tourist framing of the target culture, sort of the ways that we tend to essentialize or tokenize or exoticize the target culture, partly in order to make it attractive and interesting to our students, but there's a cost to that may come along with it. And then one that I'll address quite a bit in this short presentation is kind of the way that we often, especially in introductory and even intermediate level of language instruction, tend to either avoid or even ignore what we would call real world issues, things that are going on in the world or events in the world in the target societies. And when I say target societies, obviously for Spanish, that's an awful lot of countries. For German, it's a few. For France, it's quite a lot. I mean, pick your language, but when I say target language or target culture, actually can mean many different places. And second, so that's sort of the complaint side of it. And then the other side is sort of the realization by many language professionals of sort of unfilled potential of what we do for raising critical cultural and linguistic awareness, and engaging in and fostering intercultural understanding, which is what we are all trying to create or foster, right? And access for the L2, the second language user, to kind of new cultural worlds. That's our very often ask any language teacher what they really want students to be able to get, and that's often it. But I've more recently started to frame it in terms of just the language classroom as a place to foster compassion, in its various guises. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that a little later, because that's a very fraught term to even bring into talking about language teaching. And also aligned with critical pedagogy and social justice pedagogies, the idea that the language classroom can be a space in which we kind of help address and transform conflict in the world, or create or foster social justice. So this is just really quite kind of the framing of where I'm coming from, and like why I would want to have what I'm calling an ecological approach, which I won't, like that would be a different talk for me to detail the components of what an ecological approach is or would be, except to say that it does it approaches what goes on in the language classroom from an ecological perspective, as if this is a human social ecosystem, and that base assumption about the nature of change in an ecosystem is germane and should be considered in all aspects of curricular decision making and teaching practice, which is what a lot of this is based on that I'm talking about. And in terms of the how, like how would you implement an ecological approach, along to speak to a lot of these points that I just made, I'm going to break it into these three pieces: critical engagement with otherness, creative thinking, and sort of transformational conflict and social justice. And if you want to, later on, I put these images up here as like kind of my visual reminders or indications of what a approach is about. So these are sort of metaphorical representations. So you can maybe ask about those later in the Q&A, and I can talk about those. So for the first, I'm sorry, before I do that, this slide should have actually been before that, to say that there've been an awful lot of scholars addressing these issues, and I'm just putting a few of the, say, most interesting books of recent years that I would recommend. These are all in the bibliography too. Most recently, in fact, the most recent of them is the one on the lower left, which I can totally recommend, Rebecca Oxford and colleagues, actually addressing the whole idea of like peace building and in language education, which I think is very interesting and exciting. Sorry, that should have been earlier. So first point, critical engagement with otherness and this notion of decolonizing the curriculum. And there's a couple of volumes, they were in that slide there, sorry, the Diversity and Decolonization book by Kreiser and Malachi, and the Decolonizing Foreign Language Education volume that just recently came out, both of them. I totally recommend them to get a full treatment of this. In the Kreiser and Malachi volume, Amanda Randall gives us a thumbnail kind of treatment of what it means to decolonize the curriculum. And for those of you familiar with, say, critical pedagogy, Freudian critical pedagogy, that'll sort of resonate with the idea of sort of questioning and destabilizing hegemonies implicated in the construction of cultures, canons, and curricula. And I'm going to have, for each of these 3 points, I'll have sort of some general principle ideas to sort of ways to think about it. And then I'm going to give a few examples of how I think that can manifest in teaching practice, right? So one is to adopt a critical or critical pedagogy approach to curriculum, to materials selection, materials creation, and text selection and use. And that, I don't just mean that actually across in a particular language course, let's say a first-year language class, but I mean thinking in terms of whole program, holistically about an entire program or department, or maybe even an entire institution, especially in a smaller private institution like yours. It's actually possible to do kind of programmatic thinking across departments, I think. Anyway, you can maybe comment on that after. I can tell you at UC Irvine, it's really, really hard. And second, to define, sorry for the soundtrack in the background, everybody. Define language and language learning as not fixed and static and sort of bound to some single standard norm that is often represented in language textbooks. Rather, language and learning as sort of open-ended, very context contingent, learner-driven, which is not an easy thing to realize. And that doesn't mean learner-centered so much as it's a different idea, and fundamentally creative. And I'll talk in a minute a little more about creativity. And third, looking at identities, and by identities, I mean learner identities, but even also teacher identities, because the teacher is in the classroom and part of the dynamic as well. But looking at considering learner identities as also fluid and dynamic and open and contingent, and even considering learner identities in curricular decision-making at all levels. Now, of course, this sort of idea of, this kind of critical approach does risk there are certain risks involved, and the risk is often kind of essentializing and tokenizing or idealizing the other. So it's always important to kind of mind what you're doing when you're just wanting to take a critical approach. So specifically what this could be, these ideas, how they might manifest, and there's many of them, I'm just putting a few ideas. One would be to include inclusive language in the pedagogy. And it seems like a simple thing to do, but we're doing it in English now with people's email signatures and a lot of the ways we're writing now, in scholarly writing, but all kinds of writing. And it actually isn't that huge a leap to consider how to do it in our pedagogies. I mentioned there's a grad student in my seminar I'm teaching this quarter, and her seminar paper, she's trying to work out this issue for Spanish instruction, which is apparently not an easy nut to crack. Or reflecting in the classroom about power relation between the learners and others, including between the learners and between themselves and people in the target society, with them as second language users, and the power relations there, but also power relations of all sorts, actually, as part of what you're doing in the classroom. Definitely drawing on canonical and non-canonical texts, and doing both of those from a sort of critical interrogation of both, to critically interrogate the textbooks representations of culture, because almost all of us are using some kind of textbook in the first and often the second year, and to not just take at face value how various aspects of people and cultures are represented in there. I'd call your attention actually to some of the work that our colleague Magda Tarnowska has done on just this, where she has them really unpack and almost deconstruct the kind of roles being represented for Germany in the textbook they use. And then explore with the students issues of concern to diverse people in their new culture or society, right? Sort of get away from the happy tourist view of the target culture and really grapple with things that are important to people in that society. So if you're teaching Dutch, I would definitely be covering why it is the Dutch are, out in large numbers protesting the lockdown right now. I think that's really important. I don't know if you guys teach Dutch, probably not, but it occurred to me because I read it in the news this week. And then engage what's called translanguaging. That's a relatively recent term that's come into the applied linguistics literature, which really just means to include and validate the multiple languages and diverse voices that the students come to the class with, but also that exist in the target language society. And that doesn't just mean multilingualism or just code switching. It actually has, it's a very dynamic idea of sort of the creative use of multiple languages, including in the classroom, but also looking at how that's being done in the target societies, which almost never are monolingual or monolectal. Okay, let me see how I'm doing here. I'm a little behind, but as I had said, though, if you want to hear more about any of these things I'm sort of talking fairly quickly through, please do type it in the chat window or just write down questions that you have. So the second point I'm just calling as an umbrella term kind of creative thinking with students. And not just creative, I could have just put creative thinking, but I really mean this is between teacher and students, between program and students, where the students have a stake in it. So general principles for this would be, first of all, the faculty, the people doing the teaching, considering the nature of creativity in the design of the curriculum. And creativity here is sort of understood as novel or surprising or adaptive or functional or useful ideas, right? So by creativity, I don't just mean, oh, you can write a poem, because, for instance, things that engineers do is fundamentally creative and fundamentally useful. So not everything that's creative needs to be useful, but it needs to be aligned with what people consider kind of in the realm of useful. So even a poem is useful in a certain way, if you want to look at it that way. A problem-solving approach is very much aligned with creativity. And I mentioned here task-based language teaching. Task-based language teaching, the way it's developed in applied linguistics and education literature in the last 10 or 15 years, is very much aligned with the idea that the learner is presented with a problem or a task of some kind that they need to work out, either alone or usually really together in interaction, and use language to do it. And that this is something that should be part of all aspects of our curriculum. And this is maybe a different idea, and I did leave the parenthetical citation here because I wanted to remember to make reference to him, that if we structure the curriculum, it doesn't necessarily need to be around preset topics, but rather we can leave space for what Ronald Beghetto, who's written a lot about creativity in education, calls good uncertainty. And he calls bad uncertainty is when the necessary structure that learners need is lacking, right? The result is chaos. And he's good uncertainty, he's saying, refers to the emergent outcomes of a complex and challenging project, and that there's enough initial structure and enough support to sustain students' efforts. So he distinguishes between that. And in fact, for many of you, you might even be nodding and saying, oh, okay, I've had a lot of classes where I have happened upon what Beghetto is describing as good uncertainty, and it was a really interesting, creative kind of learning environment for my students, whether it was intentional or not. But he's saying this can be intentionally built into the curriculum. And he also writes about thinking about micro problems of language and communication, as well as macro problems of the world, and bring both of these into what we do in the language classroom. And by micro problems of language and communication, it really means as simple as, okay, you want to do X with the language, what kind of grammar would we need to do this? And then let the students work out the problem of that grammar that they would need. It's a rather different approach to grammar. And it's not just the PACE model, although the PACE model kind of aligns with it. And the macro problems kind of relates a little bit to what I said before about bringing bits of the real world and what is of concern to people in the target society right into the classroom, and let them work it out, let them deal with it, even if it's with their more limited language. And I don't know if somebody wants to ask a question later about the limits of language, especially at the introductory or intermediate level, because it's not an easy one to solve. So specifically, this would mean students working out with the teacher what grammar they would need to know. I got ahead of myself there. So if you're familiar with the PACE model, or if you're familiar with the focus on form approach to teaching grammar, that kind of aligns with that. Students analyzing and reflecting on or working out aspects of actual real world communication, whether that's in recordings of natural interaction or perhaps really excellent, dialogue in a film scene. Prose literature is an amazing source of this, as well as poetry and other genres. That students get to pose questions and engage with cultural and social, political, economic, etc. topics that they think are relevant to L2 learning, and to build the curriculum around that. That doesn't mean an anything goes approach. We know as well as anybody that sort of unprincipled eclecticism is bad. It's that kind of bad uncertainty, right? But principled and constrained eclecticism can be very productive. I mentioned here, just because I didn't want to forget, this app or this platform called Link, which is a reading platform where students can actively build vocabulary while they're reading in a second language, and it can be done collaboratively as well. So it's quite robust and interesting. And that's a way that you can help students to be able to be the ones to pose questions and engage with topics and things they think are interesting. And then lastly, having students engage with people in authentic, that means not solely pedagogical interaction, that is oriented toward those other people rather than just themselves. It's not just about, oh, I'm here to learn something, so we're going to talk with some native German speakers or some whoever. But it is about those other people in some way. And that sort of already points toward this last point, which is the social justice orientation. And I put all these here, this sort of laundry list here. Transformation of conflict is how I've been writing about it in my own research, not just social justice, but actually, like, what are we doing with that for the world or with the world? And that I put the fostering compassion and affecting change, positive change, in parentheses, because that kind of goes along for the ride, even though it can be its own separate thing I deal with. So the general principles would be framing curriculum as a legitimate setting for conflict transformation and peace building. That's the Oxford and colleagues book I mentioned. She's taking that head on, or those colleagues are taking that head on, to say that the language classroom is a legitimate site to grapple with problems of the world and to try and do our part to make the world a little bit better. It's not just political science classes or an internship in the State House or in Congress, where you can have the student feel like they're doing that. Conceiving of and considering change at multiple social and spatial levels. And this ties into the ecological model that I indicated earlier but haven't described, and across multiple timescales, because an ecological approach doesn't just look at the classroom as relevant, but actually the individuals within the classroom, and then the classroom and the institution, sort of nested social spatial levels going all the way up to public discourses. And across multiple timescales means considering the kind of change we're trying to bring about in momentary terms, what's going on in a given moment, or in a given class hour, or in a given semester, or across the sort of educational life of the student, or even their whole career. There's multiple timescales that you can consider. What are you doing with this language, with this new language? And not you necessarily, but the student. And then what I'm calling here rational compassion. Rational compassion means not just compassion writ large. I don't know, I came across and read quite a lot of the literature on compassion in the philosophical literature and psychological literature. It's huge, and it's hard to think about curriculum in these terms. But if you think about the way that a therapist or a physician approaches compassion, they try to act in the best interest of the person they're trying to help, but they don't necessarily get wrapped up themselves in that suffering of that person. In fact, they can't afford to do so. And in that way are able to be of help. So that's a useful framing of compassion that you can think about for the curriculum, even though there's risks involved too. So more specifically, what do I mean here? And this is a very cursory treatment, but you can identify real world issues or conflicts in which people have a stake. And by people, I mean maybe the students, or maybe particular people or particular groups in the target language society. And let students participate in those questions and the actions that ensue from it. Which is not easy to do. A lot of times we bring the sort of pre-packaged curriculum to the students and expect them to operate within it. We do that. I do that too. Kamakshi Murthy wrote about deliberative dialogue as a vehicle for this sort of thinking about curriculum, which are essentially structured dialogues, but they are oriented toward addressing very real ethical or real world dilemmas that the students engage with. Or creating affordances for what I've called rational compassion and critical reflection about power relations between learners and others, and build that into the curriculum. I mentioned this Willkommen auf Deutsch film and the module that I created. This is a still shot from that film, where it's a 1 hour, it's a short documentary about a village in Germany where they wanted to convert a closed up retirement home and a vacant retirement home into a refugee asylum seekers home, and how many people in the village openly opposed that and began an initiative to stop it. And it became this very public back and forth between those who were supporting it and those who were against it. And this documentary does that and intersperses some of the personal stories of refugees in the area. And it's really interesting if you present students with the task of saying, all right, this is a film, of course, and this already happened, this is history, but we're going to do it as a sort of simulation, and you are charged with being a committee that has to try and find a solution to this village's problem. And students take that quite seriously when presented with that. But in thinking about compassion and trying to foster compassion in your language class, it's really important that you approach the very idea of compassion critically and carefully, because, you know, even as Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote already, you know, in the 18th century, that trying to compel others to feel compassion, in fact, just risks being pleasurable to the person feeling the compassion and not necessarily doing much good for the people who are suffering. Because you feel compassion, then you feel better. You feel good that you've felt compassion, but you haven't really done anything. So it's something you have to approach critically. I'm going to wrap up in just a few minutes by saying, you know, well, why do this now? Why take this kind of an approach now? I kind of indicated why at the beginning, but I think it's important to consider events and trends of just the last couple of years, and really the last year, well, a couple of years, because the social movements that have really gained a lot of traction and relevance also for our students, of resistance and inclusion, I think present us with opportunities to bridge what's important to learners and real world issues with what it is we're trying to teach them to do, which is to communicate in a new language and to connect up with people and ways of being in a new language in the world. that these offer a framework for critical engagement pre-packaged. They're already there. This is what's going on in the public discourses. And they have been a catalyst for change in society. I think these movements, not necessarily just these movements, but these movements as sort of what is driving them, what are the problems in society that have driven them, can be brought into the classroom too. Not that we want to opportunize the corona pandemic, but I don't know if you've noticed it, but even as much as a year ago, any discussion of online or remote instruction with my colleagues was simply a non-starter. Like it just, unless it was a dean, and then everybody got scared that the dean just wanted to shut all the language classes down and make them all remote. It was very hard to have topics about digital media and the uses of digital media in language education. That's gone now because we're all doing it. So I've just noticed through the pandemic, people have done amazing Herculean things even with their curricula and their programs because we have to. It's like there's no choice. And so nobody's complaining about online education. Well, we are complaining about it because it's hard, but people are doing it. That was my 32 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up. And obviously the pandemic has created new opportunities for innovation because we have to do a lot of social activity in cyberspace that we never thought we would have to do. And then I hate to put it this way, but the populism and the authoritarian kind of rule, not just in the United States, but in all sorts of corners of the world, and the huge polarization and extremism that's come out, I think also presents opportunities for us as educators to try and, I don't want to just say bridge gaps, or bring people together. I don't want to sound sort of kumbaya idealistic in that regard, but our language classrooms, when we're talking about, what is going on in those societies, I think it's very fruitful subject matter. And I see in terms of the really negative, really damaging discourses affecting language education or even just education, humanities education, I think language education can be kind of a corrective of a lot of that damage that's been done in recent years. So obstacles, there's lots of them. And I'm actually just going to skim through this quickly because I don't want to just end on a downer. And I realize now that it's probably what I'm doing here, but that's not so good. But I don't know if you've noticed, but language departments can be kind of conservative in terms of real curricular change. And that's actually a potential obstacle. There's logistical and practical constraints on projects. A lot of times people do amazing projects that end up being one-off projects instead of sort of initiating systemic change. At the institutional level, obviously, we're often limited in terms of funding of what we can do. And some of the projects I've indicated do imply funding. And we don't need to talk about the long-term damage that's been done to the humanities in the last 10 or 20 or, well, really since Ronald Reagan, but anyway. And then a lot of discussion recently of systemic discrimination and racism, even in our institutions, that I believe need to be addressed. And the decolonization that Kreiser and Malachi and others are writing about is trying to take that head on, actually. And then, of course, national level discourses, hopefully, who knows if we'll see change now, but sort of I don't even want to say stigmatization, but vilification of others, particularly Spanish speakers in the United States, is horrifying, and I think is something we need to take head on. And there is definitely a sort of elitism in the United States, well, not just in the United States, about particular languages over others, and I think we need to confront those as well. So I'll to make two disclaimers here. One is I'm not suggesting that we just throw the baby out with the bathwater and that what we're doing in our language classes is not exciting and wonderful. I'm really talking about trying to reorient some of our thinking toward some of the ideas I'm talking about and make maybe more productive use of some of the better ideas that we pursue. And I'll also mention that a lot of what I'm proposing, I have had a huge difficult time realizing in my very own German program. A lot of the reasons that I list right here on this slide, but so for me, this is also a work in progress and a project that I'm continuing to work on. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I'd like to just open it up. Obviously, it's like a quarter of an hour, unless people want to stay a little longer, which is fine with me. I see there's a couple of things people put into the chat, and we can look at those. Oh, somebody just says they had to go. Matt had to go, but and Jamie, I don't know if you wanted to comment on your.
Yeah, I can just also re-say, I was trying to take notes so I didn't forget while you were
Yeah.
So one of them, and I was just thinking this because one of these things happened today and yesterday that we see all the time with texts of trying to talk about more complicated things. And then the students think that their own language is a huge barrier to talk about it because it's too complicated. When they have enough to talk about it even on a basic level, but it's like that hurdle seems to be a really big one for them to be okay with talking about difficult things in kind of a scaled down way. So I was trying to think of other ways of getting them more comfortable with that, I guess.
What are you talking about? A particular topic or that came up that students wanted to interact about or didn't feel up to?
I mean, it's happened with a few different topics, but a lot of times it'll be reading like a literary text and they'll have all of these complicated ideas and they have these things that they would say if they were talking about in English with this great analysis and all of these connections and stuff. Right. And then they get worried like, oh, I'm going to sound like a toddler if I try to say this stuff in German. And then they just kind of give up, right. Instead of trying to work through and saying it in a pared down way. There's that barrier that they're going to sound dumb or something if they can't say what they thought in English.
Oh, no, I get that. I mean, I encounter that all the time, even with my, intermediate or advanced students, because they always want to do more than they can do at their level. I mean, I would just say that there's a lot of ways of expressing and conveying and presenting and synthesizing information that doesn't entail, oral discussion or sentence or paragraph level communication. It can be organizing language that is, quite sparse, in fact, or even visual. I know that in the first year course, I would opt more for visual representations of things that they can't express, and yet, do that communication about the visual in the language, right? Just thinking out loud, but that's how I would approach that. And whenever you have a topic that's too difficult for them to do in the language at the time, right? So Janet, you want to hear about the pictures. Well, that's sort of the basis of some of the key ideas of an ecological approach as I framed it, which is based in part on complex dynamic systems theory. And so the bulbs is actually onions, because Leo van Leer, who's one of the prominent scholars who developed a lot of these ideas, reframed language not as a hierarchical system the way that generative linguistics does, for instance, rather as a nested system in which all the levels interact with each other simultaneously, and that you can't really separate them. And his metaphor, his analogy that he used was that, language is like an onion. You can't peel away the layers of the onion to get to the real onion inside. It's layers all the way down. And I actually, in my work, I said it's actually a living onion, because if you think about a living plant, the bulb or the root, it's actually dynamic, and that there's lots of exchange going on. So it's a metaphor. The other one, the butterfly, refers to, I don't know if you've heard of the you know, the butterfly flapping its wings in the rainforest unleashes a tsunami 10,000 miles away, that Edgar Lawrence said in his article, I want to say 1972 or something, when he initiated sort of chaos and complexity theory, and talking about what's being meant there is the non-linearity of change in dynamic systems. So whether it's a weather system, which is what he was writing about, he was a meteorologist, or a natural biosystem like a forest, or a human being as an organism, or any living organism as a dynamic, complex dynamic system. And by nonlinear change, that means that the relationship between causes and effects is disproportional. In other words, very tiny changes in the initial state of a system can lead to really big changes later on that you can't necessarily predict. That's the butterfly analogy that he's making. It's not actually an analogy. He's saying that's actually true. And that conversely, you know, huge changes can actually lead to disproportionately small effects that you cannot also likewise cannot predict. And so if you transfer that thinking to language learning, the idea is that in fact there's certain aspects of the kinds of change that learners undergo when they're learning a new language can't be predicted exactly. It doesn't mean you can't predict that the change will happen, but not necessarily when or in what magnitude. And if you think about the diversity of outcomes of, say, 25 people learning the same language, that is one way to account for why it is that some people appear to go very quickly and use forms very productively at time one, where other people aren't there yet, and like that. So it's also a way of thinking about timescales of change. And then the third one, the surfer, is just my own. It's been maybe because I lived in California for a long time, but it was my way of getting my head around a complex system and how it works. And in a complex system, all the components affect all the other components in some way. Even if you can't perceive them, and even if the effect on some components may be extremely minimal and others may be really big, right? So if you think about a surfer getting up onto a surfboard to ride a wave, as soon as she gets up on that surfboard, that's a complex system that comes into being. And the system is this person on a board on a wave. And so all the components of that system are affecting all the others, right? Except that the effect on the surfer from the wave is much bigger than the effect of the surfer on the water. Even though there is an effect, the water is not the same because she was riding on it, right? So if you think about that in terms of how language teaching happens, if you think about the trajectory that somebody takes from the moment they begin or undertake to learn a new language, you can't predict exactly the path that they're going to go. You just can predict what the parameters are to make it likely that they're not going to fall off, right? I mean, if you're thinking about the surfing. And these are just sort of visual metaphors that have helped me to think through what a complexity approach means, and how it is for language teaching. It's actually not just metaphorical. I think that's actually how human development happens. And if you read, say, sociocultural theory, or if you read Bakhtin's account of how language works, the way that he analyzed it, it very much aligns with this thinking about how we make meaning and how we are able to make sense of what other people do with words, right? So Jane wrote, oh wait, I don't want to, oh, you shared a link to a TED Talk. I don't know that one. I'll take a look. Why don't you just share your question, Jane, so I don't just sit here reading. Tell us what it is you're getting at.
Yeah, no problem. So together with my students, I've developed a project, and I think I spoke about it in the language cohort last spring. And it's an e-portfolio where they go and they sort of interrogate the culture according to their own interests and curiosities. And so it's like sort of my attempt to go beyond this sort of cookie cutter, section of the textbook that gives you a little blurb about, I don't know, X holiday and Y, tradition. So the idea was to sort of, make sure that it was learner driven according to their interests and their sort of intellectual curiosity about these cultures. And, on the one hand, I should probably preface this by saying that, I've yet to do my due diligence in terms of scaffolding their topics. So I realized that I should go through this layered process of having them submit their ideas and then sort of giving them feedback and developing the topics in that way. But that sort of just stretches the project out over a longer period of time, and we don't have the luxury of doing that in an intermediate language course. So for me,
that also risks having the students feel like you're co-opting their project too. I mean, there's a flip side risk to that, right? Like, oh, everything's got to be vetted by my teacher or else it's not, you don't want that either, right?
Right. Yeah. So, it turns out that we've had a lot of interesting projects and students that have been really thoughtful in this, in doing their research, and others that sort of fall into this, like, I won't go, they haven't gone as far as the running of the bulls in Pamplona, but, something that's more, evident, immediately evident, and hasn't required a lot of digging or discovery on their behalf. So for me, I just wonder if you have any insight on, you've thought a lot about all of these ideas, and I found it really interesting. I'm scribbling all my notes over here, but I don't know if you have any tricks or trade or whatever to get at that, really.
My first trick would be to tell you to sit down and have a cup of coffee with Jamie, because she's actually worked out a lot of this kind of stuff with her students with some very difficult material and ways to scaffold it enough so that they can do it, right? Because it's about the enough part. It's like giving them enough structure so that they can do what you are imagining they would be able to do. Because if you just throw them into it and say, go investigate aspects of culture and I'll read your portfolio later, that's not enough structure, right? I mean, so, I mean, just from the outset, based on what you said, I do think it's important before they even go and do that you sit with them and sort of pose the questions that they think they would want to ask, and your job then is to kind of help them formulate questions that would likely lead to the best outcomes, right? And then of course, I do think it's important, if you're going to have them do, say, an e-portfolio, there's nothing wrong with you giving them a set of rubrics and guidelines to say, this is how you should do this, and this is what you shouldn't do, right? So, don't just go to the Wikipedia page and make a PDF of it and stick it in your whatever, whatever you want to call the parameters or the guidelines. Some of them have to do with like the standards you have or what you expect. Setting goals with them that have to do with like the language. So what about the language? Are they learning new vocabulary as they're doing it? Is there any grammar learning that's built into this, just sort of procedurally? And then like, what is it they want to get out of it? So for instance, if they're going to talk about the Pamplona, that's fine, but you can just look on Wikipedia and find out about that. Well, what is it about that? Like, do you want them to take a critical approach? Do you want them to look at the economic impact of the running of the bulls on that region or that town or whatever, right? Or I don't know. I'm thinking you can do the thing to kind of push them to take critical stance, and it doesn't mean you have to review and vet everything they do, but so I think it's really cool. And in fact, portfolios of various kinds as a means of assessing is a really productive way to help learners gain the autonomy that we want them to have, right? Because it's all about learner autonomy, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
And Julia, do you want to encapsulate what you've?
Yeah, I realized it was a little. I just wanted to say there were two ideas that you expressed that I think I've always had as kind of preoccupations, but you'd really like put them into words in a way that was like, oh, yes, thank you. It's the idea of the happy tourist syndrome, and also the line between compassion and voyeurism when dealing with the kind of experiences of people who might be marginalized within the language communities we're teaching. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, and especially as like someone teaching Spanish, that just really resonates for me, because it's weird to live in a world where heritage or native Spanish speakers are vilified for speaking their language, and then have L2 learners coming into the classroom where they experience as Spanish speakers a lot of, you know, like sense of whatever. So I just was thank you for that, and also just wondered if you just had any thoughts on just how to kind of navigate just that anxiety of, am I doing it right?
I do think, especially with Spanish, not only with Spanish, but in terms of the United States and its makeup, I think that the sort of post-colonialized, or the decolonization project that some scholars have undertaken is really important, because it holds the potential to really confront a lot of those issues in the curriculum. So I mean, I would take a look at that, at this volume done by Macedo. It's in the PowerPoint here too, as well as the German. It's on German, Decolonizing the German Curriculum by Kreiser and Malachi, but it gives you a lot of thinking about it. And then a lot of the work done by Robert Train from Sonoma State is about just this issue of sort of decolonizing the Spanish curriculum, or foreign language curriculum, but Spanish in particular. Because I do think, you know, I taught in Texas for a number of years, in San Antonio and in Austin, and I talked to many Spanish speakers who came from South Texas, and you know, I've hardly ever heard people disparage their own native language as much as those people sometimes, you know. And a lot of the Spanish teachers who I interacted with, a lot of their job was just to kind of validate that, no, you speak real Spanish, you know, it's just not Castilian Spanish or whatever. And so it is about validating the whole range of varieties. So a lot of the approach I'm talking about does imply bringing in different regional variations, social and sociolectal, sort of socioeconomic variation, generational variation, because young people speak very differently from older generations in almost every society. And that's valid linguistic material to talk about. It doesn't mean you're teaching the students those varieties, but raising awareness about them alone is hugely valuable. And even maybe even going deeper than that and saying, well, you know, kind of looking at the hegemony or the power dynamics of the standard norm, right? Whether that's French or Spanish or even Mandarin, in China is a huge issue, I think. For instance, this is all material that you could use, you know, with the students, so that they don't just go into it thinking, oh, there's only one German that I'm learning, and then they get to Germany and hit what Diane Larson Friedman called the inert knowledge problem, of the gap between the sort of pedagogical standard language they learned and the way people actually speak in the world, and how many problems that causes for them. Not to mention the power differential between second language users of a language and native speakers, right? Where it's always going to be a different power relationship in an interaction, right? And Dick's asking about the elitism. Well, what I meant by that is, you know, we tend to valorize languages like French and German, or even Castilian Spanish, and we tend to diminish other languages in terms of their importance or value. And it usually is based on value, sort of a market orientation of which languages are most useful. So I don't know if isn't one of you a Russian teacher here? Was there a Russian teacher? Oh, she left maybe.
Yeah, she was.
That's a huge issue of sort of the value of learning Russian, right? The sort of vicissitudes of that, following the Cold War and whatever, and when it was an important strategic language for national security and all kinds of money was flowing into it. So that one, or even, you know, I find it ridiculous that we don't teach Portuguese at UC Irvine, for instance, or a lot of institutions don't teach Portuguese. And I think that's a sort of a linguistic elitism that says, well, you know, what's the utility in that? And so there's often a utility argument, or a social capital, or political capital argument being made for learning particular languages, especially English, obviously. I don't know if that addressed your point, Dick, but or what you were getting at.
Yeah, and when you were talking also with Julia, I was listening to that as well, and that also is a part of it as far as I'm concerned. You know, by the very fact that you speak a French Canadian as compared to a Parisian.
Right, that's a great example. Yeah, yeah. Now, when I had French, our teacher, I happened to live in South Florida when I learned French in high school, which is heavily populated by French Canadians, and my French teacher prohibited us as best she could from going down to the beach and hanging out with the Quebecois because they would corrupt our French. So that was an early example of that kind of attitude toward language. Yeah, I mean, the perceived difficulty, yeah, I mean, German teachers are always sort of trying to counteract the idea that this is a difficult language, that people come in with, oh, we can't learn German because it's difficult. I want to learn Spanish.
Yeah, German is IQ based.
It's easier than Turkish. Yeah. Well, I know we've gone a little overtime here, but.
Do we have any additional questions?
I have one that you kind of talked about a little bit before. I was thinking about this as I've been trying to bring a lot of stuff in that's not in the textbook that I feel like, you know, that is not being addressed fully, or they're totally missing something out. But then sometimes it also kind of feels like that falls a little bit into the culture capital thing, like, oh, here's a thing that I'm bringing in from outside the book, and then we'll do it and we'll work on it. And then it's like, okay, well, then we'll go back to the book. So I guess trying to get out of.
Yeah, we are constrained by our textbooks, aren't we? Yeah. Right. I don't have an immediate solution to that except to, you know, on the one hand, integrate that as much as possible with what's already going on, saying, well, look, the textbook treats this topic this way, but we can do way better than this. And then, you know, bring that in. So if, you know, if it's doing something about, I don't know, holidays, which every textbook has, or whatever, you know, bring in material that's going to maybe unpack that or interrogate it critically with the students in ways they can do for their level, and it might be much richer. Or let them come up with the tangents, you know, and say, well, what do you guys want to learn about? And you know, I know that we had students who did that in our program, and they came with all kinds of strange things that, you know, sometimes the teacher vetoed and said, no, we're not gonna do that. But, you know, you're still the teacher. Anyway, I'm sorry I went a bit long on my thing, so we didn't have it went overtime. I don't like doing that.
No, we appreciate it very much.
Yeah, no, I am really pleased that you came late on a. Are we in the same time zone? I think we are, right? Yeah. So late on a Wednesday. So.
So, any additional comments, questions? Well, we thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll make sure and send you guys I'll send the PowerPoint so you have that. Put the references list in it, and you can also just email me if you're looking for something. But there's a lot of exciting work that's being done now that I think can really, hopefully, get you thinking in different ways.